So often when people think about improving their speed and power and explosiveness, they'll be looking at quite surface level things in order to improve. So they will look at things like exercises or strengthening techniques to work on the individual muscles of the body. And often people will message me about this and ask me things like, how do I, get my hands faster? Have you got any tips to become more explosive and stuff like that? And I often tell them the same thing, which is like, before any of that stuff, before you even start to think about that stuff, ensure that your technique is nice and efficient and you're constantly refining it as you go forward. Because if you think about it, adding a load of extra strength and power up onto a poor technique is essentially like building a house upon shaky foundations. And you don't want to add all that stuff on without knowing the underlying changes that need to be made to maximize the technique's effectiveness going forwards.
One of the most overlooked things is the energy transfer throughout the body to generate power, as well as maintain that throughout combos that you're throwing by riding that momentum, if you will. And kinetic linking is pretty much involved in any sport that involves power and speed, but obviously we're going to be looking at it in terms of striking for martial arts. So we've got two modalities to speak about here. One is a basic overview, and the other is more specifically to chaining strikes together while maintaining power and momentum. So most sports start from the ground up within the placement of the feet. We're going to be talking about a general overview of how power is generated first from the legs and then travels throughout the body, but then looking more in detail into specifically continuing that momentum throughout combos that you throw in. And this is where technique and economy of motion comes into play, and using one strike to build onto the next and so on. First off, we need to talk about order of recruitment, which is basically the order at which the specific muscles of the body are called upon and then build upon each other like links in a chain and compound to the final strike. So looking at boxing specifically then, the force originates within the feet, the rear foot drives backwards, then the energy travels up the leg, twists through the hips, then goes to the back, chest and shoulders, and then finally down the arm to the strike, multiplying that momentum through all the leverage of the previous parts. So this graph is a visual representation of how this works, with all the different body parts kind of building upon each other and compounding into that final impact point. So I found this really interesting article from Sweet Science of Fighting, and it talks about one of the earliest studies that looked at contributors to punching forces in different levels of boxers, experienced, intermediate and novice. They identified 3 different components to an effective punch. Experienced boxers had greater contributions from the legs compared to other levels of boxers and compared to the arm and trunk contributions. They also showed less involvement of the arm musculature compared to other levels of boxers.
And somebody who's a really clear example of this is the boxer Deontay Wilder, and why he'd managed to kind of score such consistent knockout numbers in his career thus far. But that was only until he faced Tyson Fury recently, who'd obviously researched Wilder's technique, understood that he needed all that time, distance and the base of his feet in order to throw his devastating punches. And so Fury's tactic was to push Wilder onto the back foot and kind of cut off his power source and his main weapons, and obviously Wilder was not able to strike anywhere near how he did in his previous matches.
Man with very entertaining ring walks. A right hand!
And win the first couple rounds.
A right hand, down goes Wilder!
And Fury also purposely weighed in far heavier than their first match to further maximise his hugely dominating forwards momentum.
So what we're essentially looking at here is a perfect flow of energy and momentum throughout the different body parts to the final point of the strike, which kind of explains why somebody who's small, who's trained to strike effectively, can outpunch somebody who's much bigger and much heavier, who isn't trained, because obviously they don't know the correct technique. However, size does matter in terms of trained athletes, because if a big person and a small person are both trained to strike effectively, then naturally the bigger man is going to be able to hit harder just because he's got much more weight behind his strikes.
Which is why the heavyweights are generally considered to be the cream of the crop in terms of being the baddest men on the planet.
Mike Spinks for the first time!
So that was a general overview of kinetic linking when it comes to punching for a single strike, but now we're going to talk about it more in terms of chaining different moves together and how to transfer the energy between all those techniques without wasting it at different points. What's really important to work upon here, again, I know it kind of sounds a bit like a broken record, I can't stress enough how important it is to have a really refined and clean technique moving forwards, because the more clean a person's technique, then the more kind of fluidly they're going to be able to move, and the more they're going to be able to easily flow those moves together and not waste energy in between.
And I'll refer to this as economy of motion of the technique, which is essentially the ongoing process of refining a technique to remove unnecessary movement to make it as direct, simple and efficient as possible. And it's this constant refinement that makes the seasoned exponent of any endeavour perform effortlessly in a way that seems impossible for a beginner to comprehend. And I won't go too much into economy of motion in this video, but this principle is one of the biggest secrets to striking speed and is more important than muscular strength. During one of our training sessions together, Adam made the observation that my movements were far more economical than his, which he explained in a previous video that he felt tired very quickly during one of our sessions. And obviously there's other things like adrenaline at play here and just generally being used to the type of training. But if you see in these clips here, Adam's not using his legs enough, making his body continue to move forward and not discharge sufficient energy into each strike before moving on to the next one.
So as mentioned before, the tendency is when thinking about speed is to try to rush through all the strikes and kind of end up subconsciously cutting them short, which actually has a paradoxical effect. So by doing that, people kind of think they're moving through the strikes quicker, but what actually makes you move through them quicker is setting up the next one so there's less movement to do between each one, if that makes sense. Now this isn't a completely ultimate thing, meaning that you have one or the other. There's always going to be a bit of a sacrifice with whatever you're kind of going for. So if you want to go for big power like Wilder, you're obviously going to need more time as well as potentially falling off balance after striking. However, if you're just going for speed, then you're obviously going to sacrifice some power. And you want to find a nice balance between the two where you're able to strike quickly and explosively, but also hit powerfully. And this is what often it looks like when you see somebody who's really seasoned, somebody like a Manny Pacquiao that looks like he's moving very quickly but still hitting very hard as well. And this is going to be different for everybody's different body types, you know, taking into account things like limb length, musculature, height, weight and everything else in between.
So in order to elaborate the example of the sacrifice, let's talk about throwing something like a 1-2-3 or jab cross hook. You don't want to extend the cross as much as you would if you were finishing on that strike, because that's going to slow you down and make you mechanical. But at the same time, you don't want to rush through every strike because then they're all going to be compromised. Even in a shorter cross position leading to a hook, my shoulder, if you can see here, is still forward delivering a powerful strike. And this is different for everyone's bodies and limb lengths. Now this is really getting quite deeply technical, but you often see people when they will be shadow boxing, for instance, they have some really nice long extended punches, but then when it comes to hitting something hard like some pads or a heavy bag, the technique changes because they're not used to the impact of it. Obviously this is the one mid combo and this is the one at the end of the combo. You can see by the difference in the extension of the arm. However, my shoulders are both in a quite similar position. I know the angle's a bit different, so it's a little bit difficult to see. However, what you see with most people is when they are closer to a target, like this picture on the left, they're obviously able to calculate that distance change, but what they will do is they will make up for the distance using the shoulders instead of the arms. So they will actually push this right shoulder back and still extend the arm a little bit like this, which actually really weakens the power. So you see my right shoulder still forward here because I've twisted correctly at the waist and transferred that energy into my arm. Whereas if you haven't done that, then the left shoulder will be more forward and the arm will still be straight at the closer target, which is nowhere near as powerful. So I'm going to go into another screen recording in a moment and really break down how I'm punching these pads frame by frame. Now this was always a super powerful tool I found in order to break down technique and really kind of tune into some of those subtle things that people are doing when they're moving. So hopefully it will be useful for you guys as well. If we take a look at it now. And the way I'm doing this one is a little bit like Wilder does, where I'm actually pushing forwards off it. So I'm not just doing it statically. If you see, I kind of shoot in from my leg. And when you do this, let me just move this a moment. When you do this, when I push this leg forward here, this actually creates a little bit even more power. So I'm pushing off this back leg, kind of like a fencing stance, and pushing in with that jab to start with. Now, when I do strike with the jab, if you see my body is really turned sideways here, and that's so I can maximize the power from this back shoulder. Often when we're doing just a 1-2 static, we'll be a little bit more forward facing, but if we watch that clip of Wilder again very quickly, you can see pretty much how he's exactly on the side as well. It's like his whole body is side on, and that's so all the power can come from this backhand and really drive through afterwards. So if you see again from here, I push in, and then as this one comes, it's got all that distance to travel straight through to that pad. Boom, boom, cool. So that's that one, and we'll move on to the next one. Now this one's a jab cross hook hook, or a 1-2-3-4, and this is a really good way to see how one punch kind of sets up into the next one and why it's really important to get your body into the correct position before moving on, so that you don't cut yourself short and weaken your explosive potential moving forwards. So as we go again here, we've got the jab and the cross again. So the cross is not as extended this time, but my right shoulder is still in that important forward position. From here, the left hand is going to come through and deliver this hook there, and it's setting up for this last powerful hook from here. So if you see here, this arm's getting really stacked up and ready to go forwards for the last hook, and I lift it up, so I'm getting my shoulder right through and pushing all that weight forwards. And when you're kind of going through all these again, it's almost like you're setting up for that big last powerful shot, while still making sure that you're delivering enough power on all the others as well. As I mentioned before, you are going to sacrifice some level of extension in order to carry on the techniques quick, as well as kind of dropping your hands down. I'm sure there's going to be some people in the comments that are saying things like, oh, you drop your hands, but if you watch through this footage of Manny Pacquiao again, he does exactly the same. When you're traveling at this kind of speed, you have to drop your hands in order to set up the next strike, because if you don't, it's actually going to be slower moving forward. So that's why that kind of happens, and if you see it in full speed, it's hardly really going to be much of a problem. Now this last one I want to talk about is something that I saw Andy Ruiz Jr. do, and he's an absolute savage powerhouse. So I was kind of watching how he was hitting this this huge pad, which I think is called a claw. I'll just show you that clip now. And I was watching how he was moving and studying what he did in order to generate that power. And what I observed was he actually punches through the pad first before he throws his second shot. So if you see me here, I'll hit right through with my right hand first, and then a left low body shot afterwards. But the important thing to talk about here is how I actually punch right through the bag. So instead of just stopping here and then going into this shot here, by actually punching right through, can you see how now I'm turning my body almost completely away from the bag? And that's just going to generate a massive amount of power from this backhand. And this is actually still really classed as kind of like a lead hook, but because if you start from here, that's actually my lead hook position. And the backhand comes right through and almost makes this like a rear hook. So it's like switching completely, twisting at the waist. I know my body's turned a little bit more now, but if you were to see almost from this angle, you'd almost see like the right side of my face here actually past the bag. And then this gives me all this leverage and torque to swing right back through with that nice left hook. One, bang, bang. So hitting right through the bag and turning your body away too in order to generate power for that finishing shot.
So thanks very much for watching this video, guys. I hope you found it useful. If you have any questions about anything, just pop them down in the comments below. And I'm likely to start making more content on my own YouTube channel as well. I know on the previous few videos, some people had asked where my channel was and what I was doing. And on the Pioneer, I kind of do a lot of like general overview stuff and more technical concepts. But I'm thinking with my channel, I'm going to do more kind of in-depth tutorial-based stuff and kind of step-by-step instructions for different things. So if you've got any ideas for that as well, please let me know, and I'll see you next time. Thank you very much.